Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads, Friday, August 6th. This is our 69th episode. We are so excited to be with you. Thank you for being with us today. We've got a fun show today. We are, as always, we're not going to stop talking about COVID because it's back in the news, and our audience had asked us a year ago to not stop talking about COVID if it was worth talking about. We've got more to say about that today in our regular COVID Connect segment. After that, we are dedicating the month of August to talking about manufacturing. Manufacturing in medtech is often a mystery. It's kind of a black box, and then it happens. And it's good to get into what it means to move towards manufacturing, what it means to be ready for manufacturing. Later in the month, we're going to have some local manufacturing companies talk to us largely about how to interface with them, what kinds of things they see and what kinds of things they expect and need. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We'll talk about that. Today, we're going to be talking about how you get ready for manufacturing, some of the common pitfalls from a design side. After that, as always, Q&A. We'll have time for question and answers. We always love your questions, and we'll get to those in just a minute. But first of all, COVID Connect, the COVID news. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Local news first. I got to remind you about the September pitch party. Oh, I've even forgotten. We are doing the pitch party again, Q3 this year in September. It's not a pitch competition, remember. It's a party. We're getting together with our judges, who I'll tell you about in just a second. We're getting together with startups, and they come from all different parts of the medtech community. But they're going to pitch, and then our judges are going to talk about what they liked and what they didn't like. And at the end, Into Being is going to award one of those $2,500 based on which ones our judges tip their hats towards. Any U.S. medtech startup is eligible. Just send your pitch deck to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org to be eligible for selection. And here's the thing. We want these areas in it: problem statement, vision, value proposition, your team, the milestones you're trying to hit, the business model that you're following, who your competitors are. That's an important one because oftentimes teams forget that they're in a competitive landscape and they forget to mention their competitors. And what is the ask? How much are you asking for? When do you need it? What's it going to go for? How is it going to help you move the ball forward? All those things are really important. Send that pitch deck to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org. And then one Friday in September, each of those candidates will get a chance to pitch for 10 minutes. Those pitches will be recorded. And in the last show of September, our judges will judge the pitches and tip their hat towards a winner. And here are our judges. Andy Rader, he's the managing partner of Evergreen M&A Partners. We are in love with Evergreen. They're a phenomenal outfit because they understand how to find value in companies that are midstream. It's really, really critical. Andy, a brilliant guy, a great team there. Dr. Nikki Kennedy, vascular surgeon and many other titles. She's the founder of Arbor Hive, and she is a prolific thinker. She's also with Arbor Hive getting docs together, banding them together to say, hey, we have to take initiative for innovation. We need to help each other understand what this process looks like. So whereas a company like Into Being, we help folks just like that, it's really important for them to talk together too and to understand what works, what doesn't, and those kinds of things. Dr. Nikki Kennedy, one of our judges. Jim Metzger, the president of Keystone Solutions Group, a turnkey design and manufacturing medtech company on the west side of the state of Michigan. And Stacy Frankovich, the program manager from the MedHealth cluster coming out of Techtown in Detroit, herself no stranger to startups. Okay, with that news, we're going to go on to the COVID metrics and vaccine distribution, our COVID Connect segment. You may remember a year and a half ago when this show started, the entire show was called COVID Connect. It's the reason it got started. But for better or worse, COVID Connect is still a part of what we do here. And the news is changing rapidly. We have some more to talk about today. And the first, the state profile report. We will tip our hat to the CDC. They're doing a much, much better job than they were doing of tracking things. They continue to expand their state profile reports, which you can get at cdc.gov. This one segment for the state of Michigan showing community transmission. If you look, this graph was mostly blue. This map was mostly blue a few weeks ago. That was good news, low community transmission. And if you look at that graph on the right, we're just seeing the red start to peak over the top. But based on where it's gone the last 2 times, I'm pretty sure we know where that's going again this third time. And so we fully expect Michigan to be well back in the red in the near future, as those are pretty steep drop-offs. Well, let's talk more about this. We're seeing the positivity rate in the state of Michigan start to creep back up there. Still not high by absolute standards, but it is going up, even though testing is down. So that's important, right? We are seeing the positivity rate creep up there. Hospitalizations have not come back up yet, but of course they lag cases. We're not showing the death graph right now, and it hasn't come up, but of course that lags cases by a good solid 4 weeks in most cases. So we are seeing this rise start to happen. We fully expect things to drop back into high transmission once again. CDC has been using a new map, which is really neat. It's not showing much right now, but it has the promise of showing a lot as this fall progresses, unfortunately. And what it shows is cases in the last 7 days per 100,000 people. That's sort of the darkness of the square or the county versus the percent of the population that's fully vaccinated. And what we would hope to see is lots and lots of those bright green squares, bright green counties, and very, very few of the others. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is very middling in all of this. You can find counties that have high vaccination rates and high transmission, counties that have high vaccination rates and low transmission, counties that have low vaccination rates and high transmission, and counties that have low vaccination rates and low transmission. It's all over the place. And this brings us to sort of the challenge that has been occurring nationwide and really worldwide. The vaccine uptake has obviously dropped and dropped and dropped until it's plateaued since June, the middle of June. It is plateaued now, but it's only about 500,000 doses per day being administered. But nevertheless, that does increase the number of folks who are vaccinated. But we're hearing all sorts of things like this from the media. We keep hearing breakthroughs are rare, or vaccinated individuals can't transmit the virus. Now, we have to emphasize, the vaccine has consistently shown, all of the vaccines have consistently shown that they generally result in good outcomes for people who've been vaccinated. Lack of hospitalizations, or if you're hospitalized, better outcomes. So it's not a ding against vaccines. But we keep hearing that breakthroughs are rare and that vaccinated individuals shouldn't be transmitting the virus. And we've got to ask, really? Here's from the Boston Globe, but you'll find this in many places. It turns out that the CDC scaled back tracking breakthrough cases just as the Delta variant was starting to grow. From Boston Globe, the U.S. agency leading the fight against COVID-19 gave up a crucial surveillance tool tracking the effectiveness of vaccines just as a troublesome new variant of the virus was emerging. They stopped tracking breakthroughs in the month of May. And now, of course, the consequences are beginning to show. Quote, not only is the Delta variant more contagious, health officials now believe it more readily causes symptomatic and contagious illness in vaccinated people. That meant, unlike with previous variants, vaccinated people are more likely to spread the disease more easily to unvaccinated individuals or those who are vaccinated but vulnerable because of their age or health. It's a new dynamic that punches a hole in the wall of immunity that the U.S. had been building to cordon off and stamp out the virus. And that is what the data is starting to show. Countries like Israel have been tracking this and reporting very, very transparently. It was weeks ago now that Israel came out and showed that the Pfizer vaccine, arguably a wonderful vaccine and perhaps even the leading vaccine, was just 39% effective in preventing infection. That doesn't mean it's not useful. That doesn't mean it's not good at helping folks get exposed to the signature of the virus so that their reaction is less severe. shown consistently to be good at doing that. But in terms of preventing infection, not so much. It's not what we're seeing. And yet, much of the media that we hear continues to encourage us to think that it will prevent infection. This from the CDC, outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 infections in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Great vaccination uptake in the state of Massachusetts. Vaccination coverage among eligible Massachusetts residents at the time of this outbreak and the time of this study, 69%. That's basically the 70% that was being targeted for herd immunity initially. It turns out that in this outbreak of approximately 500 people, 3/4 of the cases, 74%, occurred in fully vaccinated persons. And of those, very few were hospitalized. But of the ones who were hospitalized, 4 out of the 5 were fully vaccinated, only 1 was not. This is not what we have been hearing out of the media, but this is what the data continues to show. In fact, the folks at NPR are coming very, very clear on this and showing how the CDC is updating its masking guidance. Now, this is frustrating to a lot of people because many people were told if you get the vaccine, it's over for you, you're going to be great, we're going to go back to life as normal. So this is understandably frustrating. But what the CDC is saying here does appear to match with the data. The CDC was criticized for not sharing the data behind their decision, but then they did, and NPR says the data is sobering. This outbreak in Provincetown, for example, shows what we just told you, but it also found no significant difference in the viral load present in the breakthrough infections occurring in fully vaccinated people. So that's to say, the viral load is higher than the alpha variants, and it's about the same in folks who are vaccinated and folks who are unvaccinated. So this is not great news. This is really not great news. But it's behind the CDC's recommendation that masking, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, in areas of high transmission. And having looked at the data and often sat back and just waited, we have to say we agree. This makes a lot of sense. In fact, it goes to this larger issue that many are seeing, and the folks over at Slate wrote a wonderful article on, which they called The Noble Lies of COVID-19, detailing places where administrations of various types have said things that were materially false in order to achieve an outcome that they desired, and pointing out very well how this has broken trust with people in the US and obviously even worldwide. So here we are at this point in time when a major effort, a wonderful effort, a concerted effort is leading to results that are not what we were hoping for. I thought this quote was great from the Israeli news source Haaretz. The virus, which will likely be with us for a long time yet, continues to shatter many of the prior assumptions about it. This is further proof that journalists, too, would do well to display a little more skepticism in light of the magic solutions proposed by experts, who promise that they have supposedly found the most effective means and methods to curb the epidemic. In fact, we heard early on that most vaccines for things like the flu, we've had doctors on the show who said flu vaccines are usually great if they're 30% effective. And with these changes coming to COVID, unfortunately, that reality appears to be catching up. So here's the upshot. And it's what the CDC is recommending. And I've got to say, in our own business, we're taking it to heart. We've just implemented, don't want to, but we've just implemented a new masking policy, which is to track the community spread. And this is a picture of the community spread of COVID in the US right now. The country is pretty much red. Michigan is heading back in that direction. We'll see what happens with the Northeast. It will probably go there too. And so we're certainly taking that step in our own business of saying, we're going back to masking. It's the one thing that has ever been able to drop those rates. And so we do encourage people to get vaccinated. It's gonna protect them as individuals. But right now, this is a step that makes sense, and it's one that we are encouraging our own staff to do. We're taking that step starting the beginning of next week, that's probably going to be with us for a while. So I wanted to share that with you as you're pondering what to do next. This is what we're seeing. We're not doctors, but this is what the data seems to be saying to us. Again, take it on your own advisement and do what makes sense and what's in keeping with your local regulations. That's the COVID news. One more thing to say about that, and that is, for those of you who've been with the show for a long time, COVID tracking project, we miss you. We wish you were still here doing what you did so well up until March 7th of 2021. Great data collection, of course, now archived and findable for those early days of COVID, but we do miss the COVID tracking project. Well, next up, August is Manufacturing Month. We are looking forward to talking with you about all things manufacturing because, frankly, you can have a great idea, you can get funding for it, you can be ready to push it forward and have a great team. But at some point, you've got to make what it is that you designed. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk with different manufacturers in the state of Michigan in August. And before we get there, today, what we want to talk about is, are you ready for manufacturing? And there's many facets to this question. We couldn't possibly cover all of these things in one session, but there's many considerations that you should be thinking about as you approach the question of manufacturing. Well, here's one way to think about it. You probably weren't ready to go to manufacturing if the vendor you're working with says, no thanks, I can't do that for you. You'll have to look somewhere else, if they no quote your project. And we've had many people come to us at Into Being saying, a vendor no quoted me. They said they couldn't build what I wanted them to build. We've taken that package, we've put it in a format the vendor understands, talking about many of the things that we'll touch on today. And that very same vendor will then quote on the project and say, oh yeah, we can do this now. Partly we're speaking the right language. Partly we're thinking about the things that matter to the manufacturer. We want to unpack some of those with you today. Here's another one. Did you have to stop production soon after starting? Maybe you got to manufacturing and quickly realized this isn't working. Well, that's a sign that you weren't ready for manufacturing. Or a closely related one. And there's a story that goes with this. Many years ago, I received a call soliciting me for employment. Folks knew I was a design engineer at the time. And they said, we desperately need design engineers on this manufacturing floor. Well, alarm bells started to go off in my head because you shouldn't need a whole bunch of design engineers on your manufacturing floor. And in fact, this company had just received a warning from the FDA. They were under consent decree. It was a major, major mess. And it was a good thing that I didn't step in that direction. But that's a warning sign if you have to have your engineers participating in a lot of what's happening on the manufacturing floor. Maybe the cost of goods sold ends up being higher than you expected. That's an indication that maybe you weren't ready for manufacturing. These and many more are things you want to avoid. You don't want to get to this point. And so we're going to talk about some things that you can be thinking about with your development team as you approach the process of manufacturing. Now, you've heard the term DFM, Design for Manufacturing. We'll talk some about that today. But there's many design for elements that you can think about. And all of these interplay in your development process. So you can design for regulatory. If you've listened to the show much, you know that most of the time we're talking about how do I strategize and how do I ready myself to be ready to go through the FDA clearance process for a 510K or a de novo, or maybe I'm a class 1 and I can get in without too much oversight. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today as well, but how you structure your design project applies to whether you're going to make it through the regulatory process. There's also design for function, and this may seem like a no-brainer, but many times innovators will get to a point where they haven't really demonstrated the functionality of their product. It goes without saying that that's way too early to take it to manufacturing. You still have to demonstrate that functionality of the product. We'll talk about that. Then design for manufacturing or design for manufacturability. This is a really important one. We'll unpack a little bit about what that means. as well as design for assembly, often overlooked but an important topic, and design for service, as well as design for test, which generally applies more to electronics than other types of devices. So where does design happen? If you've listened to the show much, you know about the design waterfall, the FDA's expected approach to development. Of course, we turn these into design stages, things like design input, design output, verification, validation, design transfer. And right in the middle is the design process itself. It's the kind of thing that many of us do well when we're just tasked with a problem. You tell me what I need to do, I can go figure it out. There are many, many creative minds. Many of you are those creative minds as well. If you can tell me what the requirement is, I will find a solution. But what's important about the design waterfall and about FDA's approach to design controls is that there's not just the design process itself. There's not just the creative coming up with cool solutions. There's understanding whether those solutions meet a need. Is the need described? And have we proven that the solution meets the need? All of that has to be done. It's part of the design process. It's part of the design control process. So design for manufacturing and for service and for all of these things has to happen. And will some of it happen late? Will you discover things after manufacturing starts? Of course you will. What we're talking about here today is getting that design far enough and intelligent enough that a manufacturer will reasonably be able to quote it for you, take it, and give you a timing and cost that makes sense for you, that's within your targets, and that you've started that conversation in a way where you can both respect what the other is doing. I can give you one negative example before we get into some of the content here. And that is a company that came to us one time and said, can you reverse engineer our product? And we looked at them and we said, what do you mean? Why would we reverse engineer your product? And they said, well, we contacted a manufacturer because we thought we knew what we wanted. And they actually did all of the design work for us. Well, the relationship soured. The manufacturer said, we own all that design work. And the client was left out on their ear because they didn't actually own the design content that the manufacturer had created. So it's important that you embrace the design process, that you ready your device for manufacturing, and important that you incorporate the manufacturers as a part of that discussion. When we talk with manufacturers later in the month, I'm sure that's one of the things that they're going to tell us. Reach out early, be ready to talk to us. What we're going to talk about today is some of the things you should have thought about before you go to talk with those manufacturers. Well, let's talk about an often overlooked one, which we would call design for function or functionality. Does the device even work? And you might think, well, I've already achieved that. Some of this emerges from the design control process, being ready to demonstrate that each of the requirements, the input requirements, is indeed met by the device. It's often overlooked, and academic projects suffer especially from this. Oftentimes, for writing a paper, a research paper, n equals 1 is a perfectly valid number of repetitions for the product. And unfortunately, that's not enough to demonstrate functionality in most cases. It's a great start, it's a great proof of concept, it's a great proof of principle, but it doesn't take us all the way to something that's ready for manufacturing. And many times, academic innovators will demonstrate something, write a paper on it, and say, now I need a manufacturer. Usually this is not the case. Had this kind of a question recently. My device, it's not working. Its efficiency ranges from 60 to 100%. Now you think about it and you say, well, I don't want it to range from 60 to 100%. I want it to be, 80% plus or 90% plus. Well, it's great that we want that, but in fact, as someone once famously said, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. In other words, can you really say that the behavior that you're seeing out of your product is, quote, wrong? Or is that what the design is currently capable of? Sure, there's always ways to tighten up a design, to make it uh, behave in an improved way. But have you done that work? Have you tightened those tolerances? Have you done the things to make the product perform the way that you expect it to? So many teams will say, something failed, something's not working, this is the result we're seeing. When in fact, the level of the design can't guarantee anything other than that result. Tolerances. You're going to hear us talk about tolerances many times during this presentation. Tolerances are something that people don't think about a lot. Oftentimes, it's easy to say, I want this to be 1 inch in diameter. Maybe it's a post, I want it to be 1 inch in diameter. And I want it to fit into a hole, so the hole should be 1 inch in diameter. Well, turns out that things like that don't work because there has to be a clearance. Otherwise, you'd have what we would call a force fit or an interference fit. Oftentimes, tolerances are overlooked. Again, at a design stage, often this happens with academic innovators where they say, I worked and worked and worked and I made this exactly this size, and when it's exactly this size, the device functions. But in real life, in manufacturing, tolerances vary, dimensions vary. It's impossible to guarantee that they will always be the same. In fact, in a moment, we'll talk about what some of those tolerances can be. And you may be surprised how wide they are, how imprecise they may seem. And yet that's what it takes. You have to be able to deal with those to be able to have a relatively economical, easily manufacturable product. Here's an example. We once encountered a company that had made 4-cavity steel tooling. The cost of this production tooling was right around $150,000, a large portion of development costs at the time, when in fact the parts that it was manufacturing had not been demonstrated reliably for basic functionality. This is an example of where we don't want to be. So you may say to yourself, hey, we're talking about manufacturing here. Why are you talking about basic functionality? I've already showed that my device works. Well, we've seen time and time again when innovators and companies actually have not demonstrated basic functionality and have sunk costs well beyond what is justified to try to start manufacturing. Here's another example. There was a project where 20 lasers were costly entities were scrapped because it was not yet time to make that purchase. The basic functionality hadn't been proved. You can measure these kinds of mistakes in tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. So as we start this discussion about manufacturing readiness, the first question is your device ready? Is it demonstrating its functionality? If you're subject to the design control process, are you following it? Have you demonstrated that these prototypes that you're building are actually, through verification, meeting the needs? It would be unwise to proceed to manufacturing if you're not sure that that's the case. Sorry for the little hiccup there. Back with you. Let's talk for a minute about design for regulatory. This also emerges from the design control process because as a part of design controls, you're not just thinking about what are the technical requirements that I have to meet to have a functional device. It's often overlooked, but we're also thinking about things like consensus standards. Here's a picture of the FDA's Consensus Standards database, which you can find at fda.gov. Are all the consensus standards that are going to have to be met, along with design requirements for them, accounted for? You'd hate to get into manufacturing and find out that, for example, there were electrical things that you had to address that hadn't been addressed in the design. Your manufacturer is already tooled up, and you discover that it's all got to change. This is the importance of considering consensus standards early. What about the question of risks? You've heard us talk about 14971 on the show many times, the international consensus standard for risk. But if the risks of the device haven't been addressed, then changes may need to be made in the manufactured device. Now, you've heard us talk before how information for safety is the least useful way to mitigate risk. But if it's inherent safety by design that is the greatest way to mitigate risk, has that been incorporated into your manufacturable design? If it hasn't, you stand a great chance of hitting pause on your manufacturing while you go back and make those changes. And verification and validation. Remember that validation has to happen on production representative parts. Do you have that validation planned and understood in such a way that you're reasonably confident the parts and assemblies that your manufacturer is producing, and you may well need a manufacturer at that point to produce the quantities and the volumes of parts necessary? Is everything aligned? Is validation planned in as a part of that manufacturing process? This is also really, really important, and you've heard us talk about these kinds of things on the show before. One that's often overlooked is substantial equivalence. You have to prove to the FDA substantial equivalence. It's a lesser thought about part when it comes to the design, but it's one that you can't forget nonetheless. Well, let's talk about the fun stuff. And actually, we've got a third camera set up today. I'm going to have our friend Steve, who faithfully for the last 69 episodes has been running tech behind the scenes for this and is also one of our crack designers here at Into Being. I'm going to stop the share and he is going to show this third camera. We got a bunch of parts right here. Oh, look at this. We got a smorgasbord of stuff that we're going to talk about today as we talk about design, especially for mechanical. And so the first thing I want to talk about is this concept of tolerances. Now, many people don't recognize that a dimension is not just a dimension, that two things that need to go together can't go together unless they are toleranced correctly. I'll give you an example here. Here's a piece of a machine part. This was for a mold. We're going to get into the camera right here. There we go. And this part has some posts on it, as you can see. Now, if I were to make a hole that this had to fit into, and I made it the exact same dimension as this post, these two parts would never go together. Additionally, as you have assemblies that stack up with each other, we'll talk about this in just a second. As you have assemblies that go together, the dimensions stack one on top of the other. Oh, if this part is supposed to be an inch thick, but it varies by a few thousandths, and then another part goes on top of it, and it's an inch thick, but it varies by a few thousandths, and then that happens multiple times, those numbers start to stack, and over time, your entire assembly doesn't look like you expect it to. Also, if you're hoping to get something made to a dimension and have it be perfect, well, get ready to be disappointed. On something like a machine part, a standard tolerance is about 5/1000ths of an inch. We've had many technologists say, oh, I want it to be a 1/2,000th. Well, guess what? When you get down into size ranges like that, even temperature of the part makes a difference, especially over larger parts. So this is something to consider, just the basic idea of tolerances. We'd like to think in our heads in textbooks that a dimension is a dimension is a dimension. But in the real world, dimensions change, tolerances change. And if you don't take tolerances into consideration, it's going to be one of the things that your manufacturer asks you about. Your manufacturer is going to say, what's the tolerance on that part? The wrong answer is 0. The right answer is to understand what typical tolerances are for manufacturing, or for machining, or for extrusions, or for injection molded parts. And the list goes on. And if you're able to speak intelligently about those, things will be much, much better. There's also this challenge of unconsidered manufacturing methods. And here's an example of this. Here's a little part. It's a really boring little bracket. This bracket, I can tell you that there's many times that folks would think, I will take a chunk of aluminum and I will machine this bracket. But this one right here is a piece of bent metal. Much easier to make that way, every bit as good. But oftentimes folks will overlook manufacturing methods that are more appropriate in favor of ones that they understand better. There are examples of this like 3D printing. People will design for a 3D printer, this of course being the classic 3D printer Rook produced on one of our machines here. And people think, well, it's what I've got, so I'm going to use it, not recognizing that the process may not be scalable, may not hit the tolerances that they need in production, may not be cost effective like they want it to be. And so I encourage you to think, is this the right method for manufacturing? Oftentimes you'll have to specify that method as a part of the design, because you'll also have to specify the tolerances coming out of it. So please, as you're considering tolerances, also ask, have I considered all the manufacturing methods that are available? For mechanical parts, the list includes machining, 3D printing, selective laser sintering, extrusions, sheet metal bending, thermoforming, injection molding. The list goes on and on and on. But if you haven't considered the available methods, you might be barking up the wrong tree to achieve your goals. Well, since we talked about 3D printing and injection molding already, 3D printing is the darling of innovators everywhere. It's making strides and inroads into the world of manufacturing, but its uses are still limited. In this example, there's features on this part. If I spin this around, you can see a staircase inside this castle. This would never be achievable by injection molding means. And I've got here an example, and we're going to hat tip to our friends over at Protolabs. Protolabs, a great service nationwide, doing all sorts of rapid prototyping services. They didn't pay us to say that, we've just used them over the years. This is a demonstrator that they created of an injection mold. Many of you have never seen how an injection mold works, but this is a beautiful little example. And there's two parts to an injection mold. There's an A side and there's a B side, represented by the green part and the blue part. There can also be what are called slides inside the mold. A slide is able to create features that you couldn't otherwise create. So for this mold to work, the slide is put into place, the clamp is closed, plastic is shot into the part. When the mold is opened, you find the part sitting inside the mold. When the slide is retracted, the ejector pins are able to lift the part up off of its core, and the part is removed and trimmed and potentially ready for use. This leads to limitations. Things like draft. If you look at this, you can see that this part is not perfectly square. The sidewalls of this core are ever so slightly drafted. If you fail to account for this in your design and say, oh, my part has to be square, it generally will not come off this core. It'll be stuck and you won't be able to retrieve it. That's one example of a design consideration for injection molding. Also, variable wall thicknesses is another challenge that's often encountered. We'll say to ourselves, well, I want this part of the part to be this thickness and this to be another one. Here's another demonstrator from our friends at Protolabs. And they're able to show us, I don't know if this is going to be close enough, maybe Steve is able to help me with the focus on this camera. But if we look carefully here at this little bump, this is a solid bump on an otherwise thin part. This solid bump is collapsing under the weight of its own mass. It shrunk more than the thin sidewall around it. Well, how do you resolve that? Well, you can't make a solid bump on a thin sidewall. It's going to look all lumpy, just like this one does. So what do? Well, you have to take a bump like this, and on the back side, core it out so that the walls are all roughly the same thickness all around. The list of these kind of things goes on. Here's an example of a handpiece that was designed into being. And what you can see here is that all of the walls are almost exactly the same thickness. It would have been easy to just make this a solid part, but it wouldn't have turned out under injection molding the way that we hoped. So there's an example of that kind of design for manufacturability for injection molding as an example. We've also seen in the world of extrusions, here's a catheter extrusion. This one has a very simple cross section, which I don't know if you'll be able to see. There it is. It's a double D shape, a relatively simple off-the-shelf extrusion. But custom extrusions can be designed and made. The temptation, however, with injection molding and with extrusions can be to make walls too thin. And when that wall gets thinner and thinner, it may not be possible. So you've gone to all this effort, you've designed a part that should in theory work, but you haven't respected the limitations of the manufacturing process. This is heart and soul of DFM, to understand what the process is capable of and to make sure you stay within those boundaries. There's also another example in the world of machining, and that is the question of order of operations. There are some amazing CNC machines out there, computer numeric control machines in the world, but in general, you don't just throw a block of aluminum at them and press go. You have to think as a machinist, how will I clamp this? How will I fixture it? Which tool will I use first? Which tool will I use second? And so forth. If this isn't thought about by the designer of the part, you stand a real chance of having a part that's way harder to make and way more costly to make with higher scrap rates than you were expecting. So once again, the theme here is understand what the process is capable of, what its limitations are, what its sweet spot is. Consider all the processes that are at your disposal so that you can pick the best one for your product. And that's a really important consideration. Lots of fun show and tell here today. We're going to move on from the question of mechanical parts to the question, and before we do that, we're going to show you a quick picture here. Some of our 3D printers in the lab, always fun toys. We do love our 3D printers, make no mistake about it, but we recognize their limitations. It's really important to come to grips with. Next up, I want to talk about design for manufacturability and a little bit of design for test as it comes to the world of electronics. And for that, Steve is always behind the scenes, but Steve, welcome live to the show. You're a guest today.
I'm a guest today. I'm not sure I can do that, but okay.
I just got to say, Steve, thank you for running this and making it happen. 69 shows in a row. It's been great so far. We really appreciate it. But you're also one of our crack designers here, multi-talented, especially in the electronics realm. This is a great example that you brought, Steve. Tell us what we're looking at on the right side of our screen here.
Yes, the right side there, that giant red circuit board, is a prototype of the first iPhone. Yes, you look at it and say, that's not an iPhone. Well, that was an early stage development prototype because it's designed to be able to be tested, to be probed, to be interacted with by engineers as they're working on it. And you can't do that once you've miniaturized it to the point that it'll fit in your pocket. You can't hook it to an oscilloscope. You can't put meter probes on it. There's just nothing to get there.
That's incredible. So the size, and I posted a picture here on the left of the size of an iPhone 1 when it was opened up, but ready for manufacturing. I think I got the size scale there right, because that thing in the bottom right corner of the right picture is the screen for the iPhone 1. Is that correct?
Yes, I do believe that is the screen. I don't know if that was the exact screen or if it was just a stand-in screen, but it's approximately the right size at least, if nothing else. So
So there we've got something on the right that works, but it's by no means gone through DFM. What would you say, Steve? Like, what are some of the elements for electronics for DFM? What are we trying to accomplish there?
Well, it depends. Well, for manufacturing, ultimately, you've got to look at what is your packaging requirements? What does this need to fit into? And determining, can you fit all the components into that space? How you're going to have to stack multiple circuit boards to get it to fit. Yeah, just that's a big thing is packaging. As you can see, the package changed significantly between those two pictures from a development version, which was a functional prototype and allowed engineers to manipulate and to make changes and work on the hardware, to something that's ready for mass production. And I mean, it would not be cost productive to build that right hand board and distribute it. There's too many big connectors, too many just generally open space on it. But no one would want to carry that in their pocket either. But the right side, or left, other right, the left one is, it's small, it's compact, but you would not want to try to work on that. I mean, yes, there are people that repair phones and computers and stuff, but it's a very specialized thing. And they're generally doing relatively minor board level repairs. If they're doing board level repairs, most people just say, oh, it needs a new screen or a new processor board or new whatever module to go into it, and they don't bother repairing it. Well, repair and changes are a big part of the development process, because you're almost never going to get a design right the first time. And the question is, how wrong is it going to be? And can you take that wrong design, adapt it, modify it, cut a trace, add a jumper wire, and get something that works for your first revision, your second revision? And then there comes a time it's okay, I've got it working. And this, then you go and you look at, okay, what is the marketing team's envisionment of this product? What are the requirements for packaging? Does it need to be a certain size? Does it need to be a certain thickness? And then you've got to look at how do I get that usually it's that size down. How do I get it small enough? How do I get it rugged enough? Does it need to be waterproof? All those kind of things need to be considered as you're developing it. I mean, okay, waterproof is somewhat a mechanical problem, but you can put coatings on circuit boards that will resist moisture as well. And that's one step toward waterproofing a product is okay. Does it immediately short if it gets some condensate on it? Because that's a big thing, is if you're in a moist environment and you go from cold to warm, you're going to get condensate.
That's so interesting too, because it's like we can take these steps, right? We can make it smaller, we can get to the final form factor, but the point that you made, I think, is really important, Steve. If we aren't sure that it's working, this goes back to our very first slide about design for function. If we're not sure that we're there, should we take that step? Should we commit to that form factor yet? Or should we leave the flexibility? It's a really important part of the iterations. What of design for volume? Because I know this is a big thing. There are electronics out there that maybe 5 PC boards will be made during the product's entire life, but maybe millions will be made. What goes into DFM from that perspective for volume?
Well, from that perspective, it all comes down to automation. How much of the assembly process manufacturing can be automated versus how much has to be done manually, and what is the efficiency of that automation? The reality is modern assembly workflows are designed around surface mount components with automated vacuum handlers that pick up components out of trays, out of reels.
And we got a picture of one of those from our own lab in the background there, a high-speed chip mounter. Those are the reels you see in the background there.
Yeah, so each of those kind of white tapes on the bottom and the background there have little pockets that hold components, and there's a little vacuum handler that'll pick up a single component, orientate it, and place it on a circuit board, which that works great. It's very amenable to automation. And then you take that whole circuit board with all the components placed on it, and you run it through a special oven, and everything gets reflowed and soldered, and it comes out the other end ready to be washed and then tested and onto assembly. But if you have through-hole components with leads that go all the way through the board, if you look at those large white connectors on that prototype there, odds are those are through-hole connectors. And those, while they can be automated, it's a lot harder to do so because you've got this big, heavy part with physical pins on the bottom that have to be aligned to holes in the board. Yes, there's machines to automate and pick that up, but it's a second step, a second process that's added to your assembly line. Now you have mixed surface mount and through hole, and then there comes the problem of soldering all those pins, which you could do it by hand with a soldering iron, one pin at a time, or there's machines like selective solder machines, which are kind of like a little solder fountain that it pumps it up and against the bottom of the board, and it can do a whole group of pins, and the board basically runs past it on a conveyor.
And there again, the real question comes down to what quantity are you targeting? And this is a question that our listeners will have. Almost any manufacturer of almost any component, whether it's electronic or mechanical, it's like the very first thing they're going to ask is, how many are you trying to make? What is the number of parts that you're trying to make?
That's very true.
Plays really deeply into that. Well, thank you for those insights, Steve. That's great. That's great. We're going to touch briefly on design for assembly and leave a few minutes for questions here if anyone has any questions, comments, or community announcements. But when it comes to design for assembly, there's this question of tolerance stack up. Will parts fit together? Will they fit together every time as the tolerance ranges over a given part? And I'm holding one part here and another part here, but this one might be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. This one may be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. Will they fit together every single time an assembly tech grabs them and sticks them together? If we're not thinking about that, we haven't thought about the design for assembly. Myriad fastener sizes. If we can go back to the close-up shot. Right here, I have 3 screws, and they are in 3 different sizes. One is an M5 by 25 millimeters. One is a 10/32 by 1 1/8, and another is an M4 by 30. To most of our eyes, those screws look very, very similar. And from an engineering standpoint, they probably would all work for what we're trying to do. Now, would you want to have to sort through which of those is the right one to go into the assembly at a given point? Or would you rather that the design team had settled on a single size that's, it's going to work in all those cases? You'd rather that they just picked the one. But many times folks will say, well, this is the perfect fastener for this situation. But from a design for assembly standpoint, a little bit of compromise on perfection is often better. To settle on one size that you can make part of it simplifies your stocking, simplifies your assembly, simplifies the tools that you need to interface with that part, makes your life a lot easier. That's a part of design for assembly, something that you can think about with your own design team as they're dealing with these kinds of questions. Well, we're quickly running out of time, so I'm going to race to the end here with just a couple more examples. A lack of sub-assemblies. Sub-assemblies are a wonderful thing for complex parts because if you have a sub-assembly, you can test it and you can make sure that it's working long before the whole assembly gets together. Also, you can pre-build those sub-assemblies. You can stock them. It makes your final assembly that much easier. Have you thought about these kinds of things? It's an important consideration for a complex product. Also, parts that are directionally agnostic. Many times designers will design a part and it only goes in one way. But it's so much easier for assemblers if the part can go in either way you put it, or any way that you put it. These are important considerations. Some of these, if you're talking early with a manufacturer, they can help you consider. I remember one time, many, many years ago, I was working on a project where we ended up with a disposable part that had a much higher cost of goods than we expected it to. Much of this was because it worked, the design worked, but the cost of assembly was just too high. We had made it too manual. The equipment to make it was too expensive. It was too hard in the quantities desired to bring the cost down. Changes had to be made, which set the project back. These are really, really, really important. So if you're going to make in any kind of quantity, design for assembly, critically, critically important. And this last one, I'm going to use an automotive example, not a MedTech example for this, just because it is so horrendous. So many of us have encountered products that we say, why did you design it that way? I can't possibly work on this myself. I can't possibly fix this. I can't even get to the things that I feel like I should be able to get to. This is a Dodge vehicle with a battery that is hidden behind the front bumper, inaccessible from under the hood. You literally have to jack the car up, take the wheel off, and then you can get to the battery. That, in one picture, tells you what design for service is all about. In the world of medical devices, there are many large automated diagnostic systems or large automated surgical systems, which basically require on-site staff to be present with the device for maintenance. This is not the ideal situation. If your business model permits it, that's fine, that's great. You do it how you need to do it. But consider, what should be user serviceable? What should be tech serviceable? Even if you send it back to a service depot, is it accessible? Can you set it up so that those operations are easy and economical to perform? If you don't, this can quickly get out of hand. Well, those are some of our thoughts on design for manufacturability, readiness. I'm looking forward to the rest of the month of August, where we'll talk with a number of our local manufacturers about their processes, how they think about this. We're going to save just a minute here. I know we're at the top of the hour for questions or announcements. If you have a question or an announcement, feel free to raise your hand. We would love to hear from you. Got a little bit of a confusion there on one, but we would welcome, and if you got a question, type it into the chat or the Q&A if you have any comments or questions there. As always, if you have any questions about this kind of thing, feel free to reach out to us at Into Being. Don't forget the pitch party coming up in September. And if you need any help with the challenges surrounding getting ready for manufacturing, don't hesitate to reach out. You don't need to contract with us to ask us a question and say, hey, I'm wondering what to do about this. We just had somebody reach out the other day and said, my manufacturer is asking for this. I don't know what to do about it. We can talk about that. That's a great thing to do. Not seeing any specific questions, I want to thank you for being here today. We'll look forward to seeing you next Friday on MedTech Crossroads. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.